So good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our second to last session here for our foundational community supports fifth session on the golden thread of documentation. Today's session is going to be specifically on ISP intervention development. So today I'm really going to give everybody an overview of the different interventions you could potentially provide to the individuals that you're providing services to. Now, this is by no means the full gamut of the types of services that you can provide. This is just kind of an overview of some of the evidence-based practices that we suggest. We're going to talk a little bit about skills training today, and I'm going to give you all some methods on how to provide skills training to the people that you're working with. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what services are covered specifically for supported employment and for supportive housing through your Medicaid regulations. So we are going to go ahead and jump right in. So first and foremost, I do want to thank Washington State Healthcare Authority for hosting this training. This is going to be an interactive training session, and I'm definitely going to encourage you to ask questions and participate throughout the session. My colleague Earl is on, and he and I are happy to ask whatever questions that we can. And if you are, if we're unable to answer the question because it's something specific to Washington State that we don't necessarily know about, we'll be happy to either get an answer for you or try to find the answer. Earl, if you could put the PDF of today's presentation in the chat box. So what I will say is Washington State, Kimberly Castle has been sending out the PDFs of all of the presentations, and included in that email is the recording. If you have not received those presentations, if you have not received the email with the presentation recording, please reach out directly to Kimberly Castle. Earl, if you could find her email and put that in the chat box as well, because she is the only person that can get you on the mail-in list. If you're interested in seeing a PowerPoint from a previous session, we can, Earl can do a little bit of digging and put that in the chat box, but we don't have access to the link to the recording. That comes directly from Washington State, because that's sent directly to them. Earl and I don't really have anything to do with that. So if you need that information, please reach out directly to Kimberly Castle, and Earl's going to put that in the chat box. Okay. And like I said, in the past, the sessions have been emailed with the recording and the PDF of the presentation. After the session, if it's not today, it'll probably be tomorrow or Wednesday. And if you aren't getting that, please make sure you reach out to Kimberly. So just some basics, or I'll put the call-in information in the chat box. If you need to connect to audio, please do so. We're going to have an activity today, but it's not going to be a breakout group. We're just going to do the activity as a large group independently. So if you can't connect to audio, that's okay. If you can't unmute yourself. However, please feel free to do so. If you want to make a comment, or if you want to ask a question and you feel like it would be better asked through unmuting yourself, you have the ability to do so, even though everybody is muted right now. If you want to share your video, feel free to share your video. Earl and I are very happy to put names to faces and faces to names. So please feel free to do that as well. But we do ask that you do keep your audio muted just to make sure that there's no background noise, because I know I can't speak for Earl, but I can speak for myself, and I get very distracted very easily. I'm like a dog that sees a bone. I'm like, what's happening? So please make sure that you do minimize any background noise by keeping your audio muted. Again, with asking questions, you can unmute yourself or ask in the chat. And we are recording this. It is recording right now, and the recording will be sent out. So like I said, we're going into our second to last training here. We've gone through an introduction to the golden thread in psych rehab. We talked about the assessment. We talked about ISP components and goal development. Last week, Earl gave a really great overview of the SMART framework. And then this week and next week, I will be closing us out. This week, we're going to be talking about ISP intervention development. And then next week, we're going to talk about providing those intentional services and then documenting those intentional services. So we really hope that you can join us for our last session as well. I gave a little bit of an overview of myself earlier in the series, but I will just say again, hello, good morning. My name is Emily Vance. I'm co-facilitating this training with Earl. Prior to my current role here at Rutgers, as a faculty member in the department, providing training and technical assistance to providers out here in New Jersey, I also worked in supportive housing in New Jersey. So have a lot of knowledge and background on the provision of supportive housing services. And that's kind of what gives me a little bit of credibility. So that's that. So let's get into it now that I went over the spiel and took up that time. So in reviewing the session from last week, we talked about the SMART framework for ISP goals and objectives. And we asked you to review the SMART framework a little bit by acknowledging and reviewing an IRP, or just kind of if you were developing an ISP, ISP, not IRP. If you were developing an ISP this week or this past week, to just use the SMART framework. And just to kind of give a little bit of an overview of the SMART framework, we're specifically looking at, was it specific about what will change? Was there a way to measure progress or achievement? Was the goal attainable or objective attainable and relevant for that individual? And was it time bound? So my question is, if you can give me a yes or no in the chat box, were you able to practice using the SMART framework this week? Just give me a yes or a no. So I have a yes and I have some no's. So what I will say is we definitely suggest that when you have the opportunity, when you are developing ISPs, that you do try to practice the SMART framework. But even if you're unable to rate an ISP because it's just not time for a plan to become due, after this session, I definitely recommend that you go back to some of the previous ISPs that you've written, or even review some ISPs maybe that you haven't written. Maybe it's a person who you kind of inherited by another staff member. But review those ISPs of some of the individuals you're working with and see if they are in the SMART framework, and see if there's any improvements you could potentially make to the plan in the future, just to make sure that it is alignment in that SMART framework. Okay. So let's talk about this week and get into what we're going to talk about this week. So in terms of the learning objectives, today we're going to identify the different types of interventions that can be used within foundational community supports. And then we're going to identify and apply methods of foundational community support interventions using evidence-based supported practices. Okay, so some of those evidence-based practices. I think we're going to talk about 4. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview on and just some resources. Okay. So this is what we're talking about. I thought it was going to be a surprise, but I guess it's not a surprise. So we're going to be talking about motivational enhancement strategies, or motivational interviewing strategies and techniques for anybody out there that might be knowledgeable on motivational interviewing. We're going to talk about cognitive behavioral techniques, so different strategies and techniques, from the framework of cognitive behavioral therapy, illness management and recovery, and then we're going to talk about skills teaching. So before I get into these interventions, I just want to ask, does anybody have any questions? All right, let's get going. So if we're going back to this golden thread of foundational community supports, in looking at the golden thread, we're in this kind of area in between the development of the individualized service plan and the provision of intentional services. And I say that we're in between because we're going to talk a little bit more next week about actually providing services and then documenting those services. So right now we're kind of in that place where we are developing the ISP and we're determining and assessing which interventions are going to make the most sense when working with the person that you're working with. Because ideally, you want to make sure that the interventions that you're providing are specific and individualized to the person that you're working with and what their needs are. Okay. Now, when thinking about what interventions actually are, we kind of have to take 2 steps back and think about the goal, right? So the goal is the larger goal that the person wants to achieve, right? This could be their hopes, dreams, and aspirations. To answer your question, Corey, FCS stands for Foundational Community Supports, which is the name of the fee-for-service program that all of you are working in. So the goal is what the person wants to achieve, what they're looking to accomplish over the next maybe 3 to 6 months, or maybe even a goal in the future, right? There could be a longer term goal. And it could be, like I said, some of those hopes, dreams, and aspirations, some of those things that the person has maybe never had an opportunity to try to work toward before because maybe they didn't have the type of support that they have now. The objective are the step or steps that the person is going to take in order to achieve their goal. Okay. And there can be 1 to 3, depending on the goal. And when I say there can be 1 to 3, I'm specifically talking about on the ISP. Okay. Because if we go back to when we were talking about knowledge, skills, and resources, you might find that in order to achieve one goal, there might be 5 or 6 objectives, right? But you don't necessarily want to work on all 5 or 6 of those objectives or all 1, 2, or 3 of those objectives during the provision of one service plan. Okay. Because again, you're really thinking about who the person is, what their needs are, and how often they're willing to meet with you. If they're really only willing to meet like once a week, or if they're only willing to meet maybe 2 times a month, you might not be able to get as much accomplished as you would if the person was willing to meet 2 times a week, right? So we always highlight the fact that when you're thinking of objectives, 1 to 3 kind of is a sweet spot. And then once those 1 to 3 objectives are completed, you would do another plan that would address some of those other objectives that might need to be addressed. Okay. And then again, these objectives are going to be those prioritized knowledge, skills, and resources. So when you complete the form with the person, the knowledge, skills, and resources that the person already has are their strengths. And the knowledge, skills, and resources that the person needs can potentially be the objectives on the ISP. And then we have the interventions, right? So the interventions are what staff are going to do to support the person in goal achievement. Okay. The interventions are specifically how you as a support worker are going to help the person to achieve their goal. And when you're developing the interventions on the ISP, you want to make sure that they're specific and clear and relate back to that objective, right? Because you want to make sure that it is very clear how the intervention is connected back to the objective and how that objective is then connected back to the goal. Okay. And then you want to make sure that the amount of interventions are reasonable. And again, this kind of is mirrored in what I said earlier about the objectives, right? You might be able to have multiple interventions for one objective because there might be multiple steps and multiple ways that you can support the person in achieving that objective. But if the person is only willing to meet with you like once or twice a month, or maybe even 3 times a month, that might not be enough time for you to employ 4 or 5 or 6 interventions. Okay. So you just want to make sure that it's reasonable in regard to the person and what their needs are, as well as how often they're willing to see you. Okay. So when thinking about writing interventions and developing them, okay, this can be a tricky thing for staff sometimes, um, because you might have you might have an understanding about what the person needs and what their goals and objectives are, but sometimes it can be tricky to try to figure out what specifically you're going to do to help that person. So something to really ask yourself is, how will the intervention support the client's goal and objective? Okay. So you might think about going back to knowledge, right? What information needs to be shared? What skills might need to be taught or practiced? Or what resources need to be acquired in order to achieve that objective? Um, so something I want to just quickly ask everybody. So let's say the person's objective for their goal is to get to appointments on time by bus. Let's say to get to their medical appointments on time by using the bus. What might be some information that you need to share with the person? What might be some skills you need to teach or practice with the person? Or what might be some resources that you need to help the person acquire? What do you guys think? This is just an open-ended question. Please put your answers in the chat box. What do you guys think? Absolutely, Krista, right? A bus schedule. Because we don't know if the person has a bus schedule. And that's okay. I knew what you meant. Right. So it might be a bus fare, or maybe providing them some resources in order to get bus fare. You might need to, so when you say they might need, so let's say, Lori, that they know the time of the appointment because they made the appointment time, right? So what's another piece of information or skill or resource that might be related to that? So I think Tracy has a good one in terms of time management skills, right? So maybe figuring out how much it's going to take, how much time it's going to take the person to get from the bus, when's the bus going to arrive. Absolutely, Lori, right? So which buses connect, the times the buses are running, you know, what do you do if the bus isn't on time? Definitely help getting a reduced fare pass, Angela. Bus tickets, and then the schedule, right? All these things. So when thinking about developing and writing interventions, these could very well be interventions, right? So writer, support staff will work with individual in order to teach time management skills to the consumer. Support staff will link individual to resources around attaining a reduced fare pass for the bus. Individual will support staff will accompany individual to the bus station in order to purchase bus tickets, or maybe going online to purchase the bus tickets, right? That's kind of how you would go about developing those interventions. Great job. When thinking of interventions, additionally, you want to make sure that the interventions that you're developing on the ISP are around improving or restoring functioning, right? So really thinking about specifically those chosen environments, like an apartment or a workplace, especially when we're thinking about skills teaching. And I'm going to talk about this, I think, a little bit later, but I'm going to highlight it now. When you're teaching a skill, you want to make sure that you're teaching the skill in the environment in which the person's going to be using that skill. And I'm going to tell you why. So has anybody here ever traveled and stayed in a hotel and had no idea how to turn the shower on? You can just let me know yes or no if you would like to share in the embarrassment. Jerry, that never happened to you. My goodness. It happened to me and Lori. I can tell you that. Thank you, Deborah. You too. Yeah, sometimes that happens, right? If you sometimes hot's on the bottom, cold's on the bottom, cold's on the top. You fiddle with things until it works. Okay. Well, still, you weren't necessarily sure though when you first got in there. There have been many a times, and I see that this is happening to a lot of us, right? Where you get in a shower, maybe you don't know how it works, right? So as you can see, this is why, yeah. So as you can see, this is why, and that's okay, Dari, no need to apologize. But this is why it's important to teach skills in the environment in which they're going to be used, because you might be teaching the person how to use a shower. Let's say your staff office has a shower in order to teach that skill because the person's like moving into the apartment. And the shower, maybe instead of having like one of those little dial things that kind of go up and then go like this, you know what I'm saying, this hand motion I'm showing you all, maybe it just has like two knobs, right? So maybe you're teaching them on the two knobs, and then when they get their apartment, they're going in the shower, and now there's this weird dial thing that they have to turn. I would be very confused, right, if this was the first time I was learning this skill. So it's super important to do that. The other example I like to give is one of my colleagues was teaching somebody how to cook. This was somebody coming from a state psychiatric hospital. They were teaching them how to cook in the staff office on an electric stove. And when they moved into their apartment, there was a gas stove. And as all of you, I'm sure, know, cooking on a gas stove is very different than cooking on an electric stove. And they were very concerned about the fire, and ended up leaving the pot on the stove for too long and ended up causing a small fire in their apartment, right? So you want to make sure that you're doing your interventions, especially skills teaching, in those chosen environments. You also want to make sure that you're focusing on doing with over doing for, because the goal of the services that you're providing is to support people's independence, right? So if you're doing things for the person, you're kind of negating that idea, right? Whereas if you're doing with the person and you're helping them to problem solve, and learn other different skills, acquire resources, and learn different information, you're kind of doing it along with the person. So again, you're going to be emphasizing independence over caretaking. And an example of this is helping somebody schedule delivery of groceries, versus picking up groceries for the person when it's feasible, right? Obviously, not everybody is going to be able to have groceries delivered, or even just, groceries, like having somebody shop for them, right? That might not be feasible. But there are many different ways where you can support the person with doing the task with the person as opposed to doing it for the person. And then you also want to use these teachable moments, right? So any unexpected occurrence could be a teaching opportunity. I like to think we're constantly modeling behavior, not just for the individuals that we're providing services to, but for individuals everywhere. An example I can give you of this is I had a client who we went to social services here in New Jersey, and the worker was just being rude and not really being helpful. And the consumer I was working with was getting very angry and very frustrated. And I was also getting very angry and very frustrated. However, I was trying to model, self-regulation and modeling professional behavior for the person. And the person ended up getting mad. And after the worker left the room, threw their pen down on the table and ended up like flying across the room. And I kind of looked at my consumer like, hey, what's going on? Like, you seem angry. And he was like, yes, of course I'm angry. This person isn't helping us. Aren't you mad? This is ridiculous. They were talking to you rudely. And I said, hey, yeah, I am frustrated also, but, we're in a professional environment, and, I have to make sure that I'm being professional at all times. But yeah, I'm getting frustrated as well. I'm just trying to, regulate my emotions. And that was an eye-opening moment for the person, because they didn't really see that I was getting angry because I wasn't showing that anger visibly. But I was able to model how to manage my emotions to the person, even though I wasn't doing anything specific. Okay. So when thinking of these FCS interventions, specifically outlined in your regulations, I want to focus specifically on the types of interventions that are outlined, as well as the methods. So we're thinking about what types of interventions we can provide, and the method to providing that intervention, or how we're going to provide that intervention. So the types of skill training and resource acquisition are pre and post tenancy skills and resources, job search and sustaining skills and resources, and then ADL skills and resources. And the different methods of acquiring skills and resources using these evidence-supported practices are skills teaching, like tell, show, do, using motivational enhancement strategies, using cognitive behavioral techniques, and then utilizing illness management and recovery techniques. And these are some of the things that I'm going to talk about today in more detail. But I just want to generally ask everybody, has anybody here, and you can just give me a yes or no in the chat box, has anybody here ever used skills teaching as an intervention or used tell, show, do, which is a method for skills teaching as an intervention? So I have a yes. Anybody else? And if it's no, that's okay, because like I said, we're going to talk about it. So I have a no and I have a yes. No. Okay. I'm getting another no. Couple of no's. Okay. So that's good to know, because like I said, we're going to talk about some skills teaching methods today. Teresa, you said yes. Jasmine, you said yes. Beverly, you said your boss talks about it. But I'm also getting some no's. Okay. How about motivational enhancement strategies? What type of has anybody here ever used motivational enhancement strategies or motivational interviewing skills? Kind of mean the same thing. Okay, cool. I'm getting a lot of yeses here. What about cognitive behavioral techniques? Does anybody here use any cognitive behavioral techniques? So I'm getting some no's and some yeses. Okay. And then what about illness management and recovery? Anybody here using any illness management and recovery? Unsure. Okay, then that's okay. And that's okay if none of these formally amber. Because like I said, we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk a lot about it, so don't have to worry about it. Okay, but this kind of gives me a little bit of an idea of where everybody's at, so thank you. And I'm happy you'd like to know more, Teresa, because that's why I'm here. So in thinking specifically about, supported employment services, we're looking at some of these pre-employment services, right? So we're thinking about person-centered employment planning, individualized job development and placement, some job carving, benefits, education and planning, and transportation with service delivery. And then once the person has attained a job, right, we're looking at those employment sustaining services. So we're thinking about career advancement services, negotiation with employers, job accommodations, job analysis and coaching, benefits, education and planning, and then again, transportation. So for all of my supported employment workers out there, are these the types of services you all are providing currently in your role? Just give me a yes or a no in the chat box for my supported employment providers here. All right, I got some yeses. Very good, very good. And these are services that are outlined in your regulations. Now, in thinking of supportive housing services, we have these pre-tenancy services, which are conducting assessments, doing coordination of care, development of community supports, advocacy and landlord liaison, financial skill building, and then benefit support. And then post-tenancy, so after the person is in their home, Again, coordination of care, doing some more landlord liaison advocacy, doing treatment planning, right? Because that's going to be continuous, developing and increasing ADLs, maybe doing some employment or vocational supports, and then doing benefits management. So for everybody out there using or not using, everybody out there in support of housing services, are these the different types of services you are currently providing to the individuals you work with? All right, cool. So I'm getting some yeses. So the idea is when I start talking about some of these other strategies, these are going to be different strategies that can support you in providing these pre-employment services and employment sustaining services, as well as providing these pre-tenancy and post-tenancy services. Okay, so they're kind of working together to help enhance service provision. So when thinking about some of these FCS intervention methods, okay, these are the different services that we're going to talk about. First, we're going to talk about motivational enhancement strategies. I'm going to talk a little bit about cognitive behavioral techniques, and then we're going to talk about illness management recovery, and then I'm going to end out with skills teaching and tell showed you, because we're going to do a little bit of an activity. So in thinking of motivational enhancement strategies, okay, enhancements come from motivational interviewing and are client-centered. So I'm going to ask everybody out there, does everybody know what motivational interviewing is? Has everybody out here heard what that is? Okay. So I'm getting a lot of yeses, but I did get a no. And I got another no. So for all of you out there who are saying yes, can anybody describe a little bit about what motivational interviewing is? Or what do you know specifically about motivational interviewing for those of you out there, to help those of us out there who maybe aren't who don't have a good understanding of what motivational interviewing is? Yeah, help our fellow coworkers out, our colleagues in our cohort. Absolutely, Connie, right? So it's helping people to build on their strengths versus focusing on their deficits. What else? Yeah, so a technique that you can use is utilizing open-ended questions to draw information from them. Motivational interviewing 100% puts an emphasis on asking questions, right? So different evocative questions, probing questions, and then open-ended questions. I like this, Beverly, right? A way of engaging with individuals to promote change talk for sustained talk, right? So getting the person from the place of where they're maybe experiencing some ambivalence, like, ooh, I don't know if I want to work on this goal. I don't know if I want to make a change here. So getting them from that place where they're experiencing ambivalence to them saying like, ooh, yeah, I think I need to make this change. I think it might be helpful for me to make this change, right? To now getting sustained talk where they're in a place where they're actively working on making that change and working toward sustaining that change, as in they are, the best example I can give you is someone who's maybe working towards sobriety. So now they are sustaining that sobriety. Okay. And Sierra, you have a couple more interventions here, like ORs, which are open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summarizing during conversation. And for those of you who aren't sure about what motivational interviewing is, I'm pretty sure that one of my colleagues from Rutgers is actually going to be doing a training in December on motivational interviewing. So I definitely suggest you go on the website for Washington FCS where you registered for this training, because there should be a registration for motivational interviewing. Thank you, Kimberly. One is this Thursday, the second one. Okay. So it looks like we started, but we're going with it. So Kimberly, can they attend like part 2, or should you have attended part 1?
They can attend part 2. They can start anytime.
Cool. So yeah, you guys can attend the second training series. And I think this is something that may or may not be repeated as well.
It will next year.
There you go. From Kimberly's mouth. Yes. So this is something that's going to be repeated. So if you are interested in learning more about motivational interviewing, I highly suggest you register for this training. So when we're thinking about motivational interviewing, we're really focusing on these, again, like I said, this idea of helping the person to explore and resolve that ambivalence that they might be experiencing about making a change. And then to get to that point where they're in sustainment, where they're achieving that lasting behavioral change. Okay. And motivational interviewing is a technique that is used very heavily with individuals who are struggling with like either co-occurring mental health and substance use, or just with substance use. But it can be 100% used for anybody who's at a point where maybe they're struggling with making a change. Even somebody who is struggling with maybe whether or not they want to start working, or someone who is struggling with, maintenance of their apartment and learning different skills to maintain their apartment. It could be used toward any change. So, do I want to ask this question? No, let's keep going. All right, we're going to keep going. So when thinking about motivational strategies, okay, to help individuals explore, you can use, and exploring their ambivalence, something that you can use is OARs, which some of you mentioned in the chat box, which I love. And OARs are open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summarizations. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second, because I'm actually going to open this up so we can take a look at this together. Because I want to be able to show you this handout. And this handout, actually, I'm going to, and thank you, Earl, for putting that in the chat box. Let me just find the screen. So this is just a general overview of what OARs is in motivational interviewing. And these 4 skills, open-ended questions, affirming, reflecting, and summarizing, are the 4 core skills, okay? And anybody can use these skills. So when we're looking at open-ended questions, we're really thinking about asking questions that are going to open up the conversation, okay? So trying to avoid questions where you might get a yes or no answer from the person. So it might look something like how, starting a question off with how, what. I love asking, can you tell me about this? Or can you describe this? Because those are kind of indicators to the person who you're asking the question to that you want some more information. When thinking of affirmations, you want to be specific. Okay, and I want to highlight here where it says affirming is different from praising, because when you're using an affirmation, you're noticing something specific. So you're not just saying, wow, that was a great job. You're saying, wow, you did such a great job with finding multiple appointments, or multiple apartments, I should say, and, getting the information for the landlord, right? You're being very specific and acknowledging the specific thing that the person did that you're giving feedback and affirming. And Kimberly, thank you, Kimberly. Kimberly put the link for session 2 and session 3 of the MI training in the chat box. So if you're interested in registering, you can definitely do that. The other 2 skills are reflecting and summarizing. And reflecting and summarizing are kind of similar, but also different. So when you're reflecting, you're listening to demonstrate that you're understanding what the person's saying. Sometimes this can be likened with active listening. But when you're reflecting, you're acknowledging like, oh, wow, that sounds like, or you feel angry, you feel frustrated, or you're sort of giving a little summarization of what the person is saying, right? So if Earl is telling me about how he tried to cook rice over the weekend, because I will talk about Earl cooking rice in every single training as long as I can. But if I'm meeting with Earl and he's telling me about how he cooked rice over the weekend and how he, some of the trials and tribulations of doing so, I would reflect in a way like, wow, Earl, it sounds like you had a somewhat challenging experience with cooking rice, but it also sounds like it was a positive experience for you, right? So that's how you might reflect, right? You're acknowledging what the person is saying and letting them know that you heard them. Summarizing, though, is for large chunks of information. So summarizing is something that you might do like midway through the session, because maybe you're switching from one topic to another topic. Summarizing is also something that you can do at the end of the session. You might say to the person, hey, we talked about a lot today. I just kind of want to make sure we're both on the same page about everything that we talked about, as well as what you're, going to be doing for homework prior to our next session. Okay, so that's summarizing. So this is ORS, and this is a handout for you that Earl did put in the chat box. So this is just an overview of what that technique is, but I highly, highly suggest if you're unsure about what ORS is, that you take a look at the handout, because it's a skill that you're probably already using, and maybe you just don't know that you're using it. And it's something that you can begin to use intentionally in a way to support your work. Okay. You can also explore ambivalence by discussing pros and cons with a decisional balance. So how many people here already discuss pros and cons with the individuals that they're working with? Give me a yes or a no. Yes, constantly. Okay. Are you all using the decisional balance form? Is that something that you guys are using, or when I say decisional balance, do you guys know what I'm talking about? Okay, so Jasmine, you guys do, but no form. Okay, so I'm going to show you this form, because when you're using a decisional balance, you're doing something a little bit more than just talking about the pros and cons. Because when you're talking about the pros and cons, you're normally talking about the pros of doing something and the cons of doing something. But when you're using the decisional balance, you're actually talking about the pros of making the change, the pros of not making the change, the cons of making the change, and the cons of not making the change. So you're not just looking at the pros and cons of how you would make the change. You're talking about the pros and cons of making the change and not making the change, if that makes sense. So thank you all for putting this in the chat box. So if we're looking at something like, let's say the person has a goal of maybe learning how to drive, okay? You would talk with them about not only the benefits of driving and the cons of not driving, but also what might be the cons of driving, right? And what would be the cons of not driving? And this is giving the person a bigger overview of all of the different components and different factors and the different issues, different fears, different concerns that might be influencing why the person is or isn't going to make a change. So you're exploring it from a larger area. But I want to make sure, does everybody understand kind of the difference between exploring pros and cons versus doing a full decisional balance? Is that clear? And you can just give me a yes or no in the chat box, because I want to make sure I'm explaining this in a good way. Yeah, absolutely, Beverly, right? It could definitely be something to use when contemplating whether or not somebody maybe wants to stop taking their medication. The other thing that I suggest is kind of doing this decisional balance in this circle. So you're talking about the either benefits or cons of making the change, and then kind of ending on, or maybe I want to go this way. I think you want to go this way. You want to start with the benefits of making a change, and then the benefits of not changing, and then the cons of not changing, and then no, maybe not. Don't listen to me. Ignore what I just said. I thought it was clockwise, but maybe it's not clockwise. What I will say though, is I definitely suggest ending on the cons of not changing. Because, yeah, Sarah, so Earl just put it in the chat box under decisional balance. And I'll just put it in again. So you definitely want to end, I like to end on the cons of not changing. Because I think that can sometimes, I think, be a little bit of a game changer for people when coming to this conclusion about whether or not they want to make a change. And the example I like to use is like getting a job, really, right? Because potentially the cons of not changing, so the cons of not getting a job are going to be that the person doesn't have extra income. They might not be able to buy, or do different entertainment activities. It might impact their ability to see friends or family because they don't have extra money to go see the bus or go to the bus to see the person. They might not be able to, purchase cigarettes, or they might not be able to splurge a little bit when they go to the supermarket. So I like to end there, but you can definitely, there is no right way to do this form. What's important is helping the person to really explore in depth all of these different areas, and definitely using those ors to do so. Okay. And then I'm going to go back to our handy dandy PowerPoint. So when you're thinking of an individual that you're working with that is ambivalent about preparing for an apartment interview, what is an open-ended question you might ask them? Anybody give me an open-ended question you might ask somebody. Thank you, Henry, for sharing that. Because I also think that's why I personally like to end there, because it's definitely something that can, potentially catapult you into making a change. So thank you for affirming that, Henry. And these are great questions. So Krista, tell me about your rental history. Madeline, what are your concerns about being there, right? You can't answer either of these questions with a yes or a no. And that's a really good indication of the fact that they are open-ended questions. So thank you, Krista and Madeline. All right, so let's get into cognitive behavioral techniques. So cognitive behavioral techniques are different techniques and interventions that you might see used when like a therapist is utilizing cognitive behavioral therapy, but they're not therapeutic in nature, okay? So two different things you can do are look at behavior modification and restructuring thoughts, okay? And cognitive behavioral therapy really specifically looks at this behavior modification and this restructuring of thoughts that are specifically unhealthy and unproductive. Okay, so really working to help the person challenge themselves on modifying behaviors that might be unhealthy or unproductive, or challenging different thoughts that they might have that are unhealthy and unproductive. So when you've been working with the individuals that you're working with, what's an unproductive or unhealthy thought that some of the individuals you've worked with have had about applying for apartments or about getting a job? What are some thoughts that the individuals you're working with have experienced? I can definitely give you a couple of examples as well. I can't pass a background check. And you know what, Connie? That's a thought that somebody in supported employment or supportive housing could have. Or the chicken and the egg, Natasha, right? So they don't want to work until they have a place to live. Or maybe they don't want to have a place to live until they can find until they can find a job because they feel like they need that extra income. Absolutely. Okay, thank you guys. Or they can't work because they need an address for mailing. Absolutely, right? Some other types of thoughts that the person might have is, I'm not good enough to work, or I'll never get that job. Exactly, Danielle. Thank you. Why bother? Because I won't get it anyway, right? Or maybe, I won't be able to live on my own. I won't be able to keep up with the apartment. I'm not going to be able to learn these skills. So those are also some examples. So when someone's having those unproductive or unhealthy thoughts, these are some techniques or behaviors. These are some techniques that you can use. So if you're thinking specifically about someone who is maybe working on a goal of taking medication every day, you can do behavior tailoring. And that's when you are looking specifically at changing their routine or their environment in order to support that skill. So I'm going to share this resource with you again. Let me just pull it up. Okay. Oh, no, wrong screen. Too many screens open. So this is a PDF that you can download that talks about behavior tailoring and how to use behavior tailoring as a strategy. And what you're doing with behavioral tailoring is you are kind of looking at their current routine and then identifying where the change that they want to make and the behavior they want to modify can kind of be incorporated into their routine. So this is specifically talking about medication because it's saying explore the individual's daily routine environment, including routines, meals, activities, responsibilities, and hygiene, and then and then this exploration helps identify ways medication can be incorporated into their routine, as well as cues that can prompt behavioral change. So something like an example of this situation I can give you is, it wasn't my client. Thank you, Earl, for putting this in the chat box. But when I was a supervisor, it was one of my staff clients, and they had a lot of trouble remembering to take their medication. They didn't use a pill box, but their pharmacist pre-packaged all of their medication into blister packs. So they had it all in one place. They didn't have to fill the pill box, and they still had a lot of trouble with remembering to take their medication. And they had to take their medication in the morning and in the night. Something that they did, though, in their daily routine was the first thing they did when they got up in the morning was they went to the fridge to either get something to eat or grab water or start making coffee. And then before they went to bed, they always went to the fridge in order to grab water. So what my staff did was they created a sort of calendar, which was really just like a piece of paper that had like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then it had morning and evening. And they taped the blister packs onto the piece of paper for each day of the week. And then they, I think, taped it to the person's fridge so that in the morning, visually the medication would be there and they could just grab their water, take the medication, and then they took their pills. And that was after a lot of trial and error of supporting the person to try to remember how to take their medication. But that's a good example of behavior tailoring because they put their medication in taking their medication already with a step that they already did in their daily routine. Okay. It might be the same thing as some people I know will leave like their medication by like their coffee maker because the first thing they do is make coffee in the morning and they know that the medication is there. But I do want to ask, does that example of behavior tailoring make sense? And are you doing anything like that with the individuals that you're working with? Are you using behavior tailoring at all? And you can just give me a yes or a no in the chat box. Yep, absolutely, Joe. Habit stacking, and atomic habits. Yes, that is behavior tailoring. All right, awesome. I'm happy to hear that some of you, for those of you who aren't currently using it, do you think this is something you could potentially use with some of the individuals that you're working with? Yeah, Connie, I use it with myself too. I'm going to be very honest with you. Okay, I will take a maybe. Thank you so much. Yes. All right, cool. So that's specifically focused towards behavior. And now we're going to talk about thoughts. So cognitive restructuring is something that you can use, something that you can teach. It's a skill you can teach someone that they can use to sort of challenge some of their unproductive fears about taking medication or unproductive thoughts and fears about anything really. And I'm going to, again, open this handout for all of you. And this handout is on catch it, check it, change it. So I'm going to ask, has anyone here ever heard of catch it, check it, change it before? And you can just give me a yes or a no. No. Okay. I'm getting a yes. I have a yes and a no. Okay. I'm getting other no's. So catch it, check it, change it is, sounds like a CBT deal. Yeah. So this is very much, so yes, this is like CBT. Okay. So in a CBT therapy session, the therapist would kind of be asking questions and exploring these thoughts and the fear and kind of what was happening with the person in session. But this is a technique that you can teach the individuals that you're working with to do on their own independently to help them to challenge their own thoughts. Okay. So you can use this worksheet, and this outlines how to do the technique. But you can also just do the catch it, check, teach, catch it, check it, change it to the person. So just these three things. But if you're using the worksheet with the person to teach them the skill, you would want to get a little bit of background on the situation and what was happening, how they were feeling, and what they were doing. So you want to get some background on the situation, the feelings, and the actions. And then you get to the catch it, check it, change it. So the catch it is, what were they thinking? What went through their mind, which thoughts best explain how they were feeling, and what was I doing, right? So the catch it is them getting to the point where they are catching some of these maybe irrational or negative or unproductive thoughts that they're having, okay? Then they're going to check those thoughts to see if they're accurate by listing the evidence that supports the thought or the evidence that disputes the thought. And then they can kind of take that extra step. And this is something that you can kind of provide education on to the person, is some of these mistakes in thinking, also called cognitive distortions. And they can even identify which cognitive distortion they're experiencing. And then they would change it. So they would then identify what would be a more accurate and helpful thought. Okay. And this again is going to help the person in real time learn how to challenge their own thinking. So that they're experiencing less of some of these unproductive thoughts. And this is the textbook that we got this from, the Cognitive Behavioral Social Skills Training, a Practical Treatment Guide. So for those of you who are familiar with CBT, this sounds very familiar. Yes. All right. Yes, absolutely. And this is, again, very much based in CBT, but a technique you can teach to the person to help them independently restructure those thoughts. Okay. All right. So let's take a break. because we went over a lot of information and we're about halfway through the training. So I'm going to give everybody 3 minutes, and we'll come back at 1:36. And I'm just going to pause the recording. Okay, so we'll be back at 1:36. And Earl just put the session 3 and 4 in the chat box. Thank you, Earl. Okay, so yes, I apologize. I did mean 10:36. And Katie, the recording should be sent out after today's training session by Washington State. But Earl put the PowerPoint presentation in the chat box for you to be able to review. All right, so we're going to talk about illness management recovery, and we're going to close out with skills training. We're going to do a little bit of an activity. And I want to make sure we have enough time for the activity because it is a larger activity. So in thinking about illness management and recovery, okay, so illness management and recovery is a symptom monitoring and self-management I guess it could be considered a tool, or just generally speaking, symptom monitoring and self-management. So it could be the toolkit, which we're going to talk about, or any intervention that you can kind of come up with that involves symptom monitoring and self-management, okay? And the manualized illness management and recovery from SAMHSA is a piece of that, okay? And IMR really incorporates education about mental illness or medication self-management skills, or again, anything that kind of falls under that umbrella of symptom monitoring and self-management. And it could be self-management of physical health as well as mental health. It doesn't just have to be mental health. So when you meet with somebody and maybe their goal is around physical health and they are you're providing them information on like nutrition, or you're providing them information on maybe their high cholesterol or diabetes, you're actually using illness management and recovery. So what is an illness management and recovery service that you might provide? And I'll also ask, has anyone here used the SAMHSA IMR toolkit? Is that something that everybody has heard of? And if you haven't heard of it, please let me know in the chat box and say no. Okay. All right, so I'm getting some no's here. So let me see something. Okay. So, as I'm sure you already know, let's open the toolkit. Let us see what this toolkit looks like. So illness management and recovery in and of itself is an evidence-based intervention. It's an evidence-based practice. It is something that is, I know at least out here in New Jersey, it's something that is used a lot in our state psychiatric hospitals. Individuals in the hospital will attend illness management and recovery groups. And I know this because we had a lot of individuals where we would offer illness management and recovery as an intervention. Yeah, so this is the manual for it, Angela. So we would offer it to them once they got out of the hospital, once they were discharged, and nobody would want to do illness management recovery with us because they would do it a lot in the hospital. But illness management and recovery talks about 10 different topics. And these are all the topics that it talks about. So it talks about recovery strategies, practical facts about mental illnesses, including schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and depression, as well as strategies and resources for responding to stigma. It talks about the stress vulnerability model and treatment strategies, how to build social supports, using medication effectively. It talks a little bit about different types of medication like antipsychotic medication, mood stabilizing medication, antidepressants, and anti-anxiety and sedative medications, as well as coping with side effects. It goes over drug and alcohol use strategies, how to reduce relapses, coping with stress and relaxation techniques, coping with problems and persistent symptoms, and then getting your needs met by the mental health system, which is focused on advocacy. So now that I've shown you all this, does this look familiar to anybody else? Or is this still unfamiliar? And if it's still unfamiliar, feel free to tell me no. Okay, cool. All right. So as I said, this is an evidence-based practice, and there is and can be a manualized approach to this. So this is something you can do individually with a person, or you can also do this during group sessions. But the really cool thing about illness management recovery is that it provides a lot of really good information on all the topics that I just named, but you don't have to do this in order. So if you did decide to start using illness management and recovery with somebody, you would not have to start at the first session, which is recovery strategies or doing this orientation. If the person, depending on what goals the person has, you can focus on any one of these topics without doing a previous topic. So you could start at topic 4 around building social supports if that's what the person is working on. If the person does have a heavy emphasis on medication, you could start at number 5. If the person is looking at reducing relapses, you can start with that, and you could just use one of these modules. Okay. The other thing that I think is really helpful about illness management and recovery is it tells you exactly what to do. Exactly what to do. So it tells you the goals of the session. It indicates the different handouts that you might use. It talks about how many sessions and pacing for this. So for this specific one, recovery strategies, this can be done in 1 to 3 sessions. And then it gives you different strategies you can use, motivational strategies, educational strategies, and cognitive behavioral strategies you as a practitioner could use in each session. So when I tell you it tells you exactly what to do, I genuinely mean it tells you exactly what to do. Okay, it gives you the different motivational strategies. It highlights the different educational strategies you can use, and then it goes over the different cognitive behavioral strategies that are included. Okay. It gives you some review questions. This is another one of the handouts that are involved. This is the orientation. So it gives a lot of really, really good information. Okay. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with this, I'm very interested to hear, what do you think about this? And Earl did put it in the chat box. So what are you guys thinking about this as I open up the PowerPoint? Is this something that you could potentially be using with the individuals that you're working with? All right, cool. I'm getting some good feedback, which I love to hear. Connie, you said you really like the specificity for those of us that are not mental health or addiction professionals. Yeah, so this is a tool that can help you, even like if you're very new to this field, right? With figuring out like, how to structure a session or what to do in a session. Angela, I'm happy to hear you already use it. Yeah, I would, so this is the toolkit from SAMHSA, Mary. What I will say though is other people, other organizations and like companies have developed their own IMR manual. I know that at one of the agencies I worked at when I first started working in the field here in New Jersey, they had purchased IMR from somebody, from a company, who had like their own version of it, but this is free and this can be downloaded from SAMHSA. And obviously SAMHSA is a very credible source. But Jerry, so this is something that you can use though with the treatment plan, right? Because again, if the intervention on the plan is to work with somebody on learning how to make friends, the building social supports module is an intervention you can use when working with that person. And absolutely, Ricky, it's very, very informal. It's, it's very conversational. And speaking of that, here are some helpful hints for using the toolkit. So first and foremost, you want to focus on that engagement with the person. And this could be a really good way to, this could be a really good way to help you to get to know the person, and get to know who they are, and what their needs are. Because especially the first one, which is recovery strategies, it really focuses on helping the person to develop a recovery goal. So you want to avoid that heavy use of handouts, and you want to make sure that you're focusing a lot on conversation, on modeling, and on role play. And you want to start with the modules that the individual needs. So you want to go to the topics and resources that are going to be most helpful to the person. So again, going to that co-occurring chapter, going to the maybe stigma, going to the practical facts about mental illness, really focusing on the chapter and topic that is going to be most relevant to the person. Okay. So we talked a lot about the motivational enhancement strategies or motivational interviewing strategies, cognitive behavioral strategies, and then illness management and recovery. Before I move into tell, show, do, I want to ask, does anybody have any questions? No? Any questions? No? Okay. All right, so let's get into tell, show, do. So first and foremost, what is a common skill you write on ISPs or teach? So what kind of skills are you teaching the individuals that you're working with out there in Washington State? And be specific on the skill. So if you're saying communication skills, what specific communication skills? Are we talking about like starting a conversation? Are we starting about ending a conversation? What types of skills are you using? And thank you for that feedback. What's really good is that the sessions are recorded. So you can take a look at the recording if need be. Is anybody out there working with skills? Connie, so how to schedule appointments to make sure they are moving forward with other community partners. How to search for an apartment. Okay, so definitely it looks like some linkages and ensuring that linkages are occurring. How to present to a landlord, how to search for an apartment. So it looks like some apartment skills. How to format a resume, how to apply for benefits and IDs, how to seek primary care provider, basic budgeting, absolutely. So when thinking of some of these concrete skills that you guys are talking about, so like budgeting, searching for an apartment, formatting a resume, even some of these communication skills, a technique that you can use is tell, show, do. And tell, show, do is a technique that I suggest people use when the person maybe already has a good idea of how to use the skill, but maybe they just need a little bit of extra support, or they need help with practicing the skill. And I say this because tell, show, do is 3 simple steps: telling, showing, and doing. Okay. And we're going to get into a technique that you all are going to be able to use to help support somebody with learning a skill, like from the basic, from really starting from the beginning. They don't know how to do the skill. Maybe they've never learned how to do this skill. They don't really have a good understanding of the skill. So when you're utilizing tell, show, do, you're really just going over the rationale with the person and discussing that rationale, and then breaking down the steps of how to perform that skill. When you're showing the person, you're modeling to them how to do the skill. You can be doing a role play with the person potentially, if it's like a communication skill. And then you're going to have the person kind of take the lead and model how to do that skill with you. And then that's the doing, right? So then you're going to have them try the skill, and you're going to provide them that feedback, and then you're going to give them homework. Okay. So it's these 3 simple steps. And yes, I'm happy to hear you use this with your client, Tracy, because this is a really, it's a great way to teach skills to somebody. Now, I'll ask you specifically, Tracy. When you say you use this skill with the clients that you're working with, are you using all of the parts of tell, show, do? Or maybe just some of these parts? Like, are you specifically going over the rationale and really writing down some of those steps and talking about the steps? What are you specifically doing? If you can give us a little bit of information. All 3. Perfect. Okay, so Madeline, you do this when explaining how low income market rates for subsidized housing options are. When explaining how they work, you mean in terms of doing the applications. Yeah, so really breaking down the steps and telling them why it's important to understand the differences in those rates, really looking at the steps. Very good, very good. Break down the steps, role play, try the skill, and homework. Yes. And homework is very important. Thank you for bringing that up, Mary. Because with homework, you're giving the person the opportunity to practice on their own, hopefully more than once. And then Connie, you said the most used is breaking down the steps into baby steps. This also provides opportunity to build confidence that they can do it. Absolutely, Connie. And I would add on to that, when you're breaking down the steps, to write the steps down. Has anybody ever gone out to meet with somebody in order to teach a skill? And then you teach them how to do the skill, you give them the homework to practice the skill, and then when you come back and you ask the person how the homework went, they said, I forgot, or I forgot the steps, or I didn't do it. Has that ever happened to anybody? Yeah. Yes, it happens, right? So that's why I always suggest when you're breaking down the steps, you're writing them down. And you're writing down twice. So you're writing them down and leaving a copy for the person so they have the steps, but also writing them down and bringing them back to the office, because I might be going out and meeting with somebody and teaching them a skill, and then I might be out for a couple of days because life happens. And then Earl might go out and meet with somebody, and Earl's way of doing something might be a little bit different than my way of doing something. A really great example I like to ask people is, who here, if you wash your rice before cooking, say yes. If you don't wash your rice before cooking, say no. Lots of yeses and lots of nos. right? So how confusing is it going to be for that person when I've met with the person and we have the step of washing their rice, and Earl goes out and meets with that person, and Earl's like, I don't wash rice. What are you doing? Now, this is a lie because Earl washes his rice. He would very much want me to tell you that Earl washes his rice. I know it's very important to him. We've had a lot of conversations about this. But that could be, thank you, Earl. But that could be something that is very important to somebody, a very important step for cultural reasons, for personal reasons. When I asked this question in New Jersey, I've had people get very angry when they've seen other people don't wash their rice. So you want to make sure that those steps are written in two different places so that it's the same steps are used every single time. And Connie, you said you use a picture of an elephant with portions of his body broken into pieces. Each piece applies to a step. It's the old question of how do you eat an elephant? I love that. That's such a great idea. I really love that. One bite at a time. That's exactly how you eat an elephant, right? I love that. That's a great idea. Whatever. And I love it, Connie. I love that example. And I think it's a really great example of how to be creative and provide these very individualized services. Because I can see how that might not be helpful to some people, but I'm sure being able to visualize it would be very helpful to a lot of people, me included. I'm very much a visual learner. So thank you for highlighting that, Connie. So an example of this is modeling using hand sanitizer. So you would first kind of talk about with a person why and when hand cleaning is important. And that's about cleaning prevents illnesses and prevents disease spread. It's something that you might want to do before and after activities or interactions with different people. You want to highlight that soap and water are definitely the preferred hand cleaning method, but it's not always available, right? So you can use hand sanitizer when hand washing with soap and water is not available. You would then go over those steps to using hand sanitizer. So you would apply a coin-sized amount of gel, and you want enough hand sanitizer to cover both sides of your hands between your fingers, just as you do with hand soap. After applying the gel, you want to rub it in thoroughly for at least 20 seconds. And you want to pay attention to the back of your hands, thumbs, and between your fingers. When you're done, your hands should be dry, and if not, you want to keep rubbing. And you don't want to wipe off or rinse off the gel. And that's how you might model with somebody how to use hand sanitizer. So if you want to take this slide and bring it with you on your next outreach, you definitely can. And Earl, if you will put the CDC hand sanitizer information sheet in the chat box, thank you. So this is how you might use tell, show, do in order to teach somebody how to use hand sanitizer. Okay, and modeling that, right? This is the modeling portion. So we went over that rationale. We highlighted why soap and water are definitely preferred, and then we modeled how to use those steps. And then afterwards, we would do the do, which would be helping having the person model back how they would use the hand sanitizer. What I want to do now, though, is because this is going to take a little bit of time, is I want to get into the second method of skills teaching that we have, which is the skills teaching template, which I'm also going to ask Earl if you could please put that in the chat box. So this is a method for skills teaching that I suggest using when somebody, again, does not have a good understanding of how to use the skill. This is really, 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 really breaking the skill down into baby steps, okay? So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to orient the person to the skill. Again, talking about what skill is going to be taught and what the rationale is. And then you're going to list the steps of the skill. Now, in tell, show, do, you don't necessarily have to list the steps. I just highlight to everybody and suggest to everybody that regardless of what method of skills teaching you're doing, if you take nothing else from what I'm saying, please write down the steps, because you will 100% avoid that sinking feeling you get when you ask the person, hey, did you practice this? And they said, no, I forgot the steps. And then you're like, oh, we should have wrote them down and I should have left them here, right? So you want to make sure you write them down. But in this, in using the skills teaching template, you're going to list the steps of the skill. You're going to demonstrate the skill. You're going to practice the skill by modeling it. So it might be role play in real life situations and homework. And then you're going to have the person practice the skill. And I'm actually going to bring the template up that Earl put in the chat box, because the way we have it on the slide is not as in-depth as the template form actually is. So I do want to bring this up for all of you to see. So again, you're doing this orientation and you're talking about what is going to be taught, why it's going to be taught, and how we're teaching it. You're writing down these steps. You're demonstrating the skill. You're doing the skill practice. You can list different role plays for skill practice and write this down and leave it with the person so they can kind of figure it out. You can list different practice opportunities. So really having that conversation with the person to identify one or more situations where they can practice the skill, and then plan a follow-up, and then doing this summary. So what the skill is, there's a space for you to write down the steps into 10 or less steps, and then having the person summarize the rationale for why it's important to learn and practice the skill, asking for feedback for you, like what was helpful about this session, what could I have done differently that might have been more helpful, and then reminding the person to practice the skill. So as you can see, this is a little bit more in-depth, a little bit different than tell, show, do. And you could use the form, you could not use the form, but this definitely goes over some more information than the tell, show, do method. And again, I think this works better when someone has no basis of the skill. I think the other way that this can work really well is if the person is experiencing ambivalence around learning a skill. Does anybody out there work with people who maybe recently or in the past have had to learn a skill, but maybe it wasn't really a huge priority for them to learn a skill? So maybe thinking about something like apartment related. I know that in the past we've had people talk about how cleaning and decluttering is something that some people will have to learn and start utilizing and applying in their, applying, right? But not necessarily something that they want to do like immediately, right? Yeah, like using a cell phone to make it answer calls, right? So when you are and maybe for an individual who is exhibiting some behaviors around hoarding items, right? Or somebody who maybe is just accumulating a lot of items. So what you can do in those situations is really focus on this orientation to the skill and really talking about the rationale. And that's where you can come in and use some of those motivational interviewing techniques we talked about earlier, like using the decisional balance, right? What are the pros of learning the skill? What are the cons of learning the skill? What are the pros of not learning the skill? What are the cons of not learning the skill? Right? I'm really exploring that ambivalence with the person, because using skills, that's an intervention that's used in an action-based stage of change. It's not an intervention used in somebody who's in a pre-contemplation or contemplation stage of change. So it's really important to make sure, see you later, Earl. It's really important to make sure that you are, when you're teaching skills, that you're aligned with where the person is at. So you might have someone who needs to learn a skill, but you also have to help them work through that ambivalence. Because if they don't work through that ambivalence, chances are they're not going to want to work on that skill. So we're going to do a little bit of an activity. And like I said, you all are going to do this activity independently. We're not going to go into breakout groups. So what I'm going to ask everybody to do is write down a comprehensive and descriptive list of steps to brush your teeth for someone with limited knowledge and experience. Okay. So I'm going to give everybody 10 minutes. So it's 20, we'll start at around 2:06. I'm going to give everybody until 2:16. And then if a lot of people in the chat box tell me beforehand that like, that's okay, Mary, no problem. So if people in the chat box are like, hey, I'm done, if we get a lot of people, then that's fine. But I'm just going to give everybody 10 minutes off the bat because we do have time. So I'll give you 10 minutes. Just write down a comprehensive list of steps to brush your teeth. And no, don't wait, pause, stop, pause. What I suggest you do is open up a Word document and type it in the Word document and then copy and paste it in the chat box once you're completely done with the steps. Because you can't hit enter in the chat box or it's going to give you one step at a time. Okay. So I'll give everybody 10 minutes at 2:16. It's okay, Madeline. It's okay. No worries. So I suggest opening up a Word document and then when you're ready and done, putting them in the chat box. And what I will say is I've seen people with as little as like 7 or 8 steps, but as high as like 15 steps. But I would say the average is like 5 or 6 steps. Okay. So I will pause the recording and start the timer now. Resume the recording. So we're getting a lot of responses in the chat box. So I want to highlight some things I've noticed. So I've noticed some variations in how many steps. I've noticed some variations in where people are starting. So for instance, a couple of people started at at the sink in the bathroom. Other people indicated, hey, you got to go in the bathroom or be at a sink to brush your teeth. One person started at the point of having to actually go get the toothbrush, which I think are really important things to start with, right? Depending on, again, individualized, where is the person at? Do they need a toothbrush? If they already have a toothbrush, they don't know that. Some people might know, like, hey, I don't need to write down being in the bathroom because I know I have to go to the bathroom to brush my teeth. Other people might need that information, right? Some people highlighted having to like turn the water on. Other people highlighted having to open the toothbrush, having to open the toothpaste. Other people did not. So there's a lot of variation in the steps, which is exactly what I want to talk about because people are going to be at different stages when they're performing this skill. And I'm going to go on a limb and say that a lot of you specifically started where you're at based off of your own experience with brushing teeth, or maybe your own experiences with teaching this skill to people. And I think it's like these steps are really good and really comprehensive. Really, really good and really comprehensive. So thank you all for participating in that. And I also want to highlight Katie's point of putting the YouTube video in the chat because there are a lot of skills online. What I will say though, with using videos, you want to be mindful of the video because some videos are more geared towards children and some of the individuals you're working with might not mind. Others might though. So you really want to be mindful of what video you're using and who the audience is that it's geared toward and who your person is that you're working with. And there's videos out there for everything. I had a client who didn't really want us to come into her apartment, but her goal was to learn how to cook. I may have mentioned this already in this training. I feel like I talked about this recently. But anyway, my staff were teaching her how to chop by using YouTube videos because she wanted to learn how to chop, but she didn't want us to chop the food with her, right? So there's YouTube videos out there for a lot of different skills. So those are some of the things that I noticed about the differences in the lists that were shared. And absolutely, Ricky, right? You need to be more specific with a person that doesn't have a house or a place to do so. So maybe part of it part of the steps is figuring out a safe place for them to go to brush their teeth. Is it a store in the area that they can go and use, like a public restroom? Is it a friend's house? Where exactly? That might be where they're starting first. That was a really good point, Ricky. Did anybody else notice any other differences in the steps? Other than what I noticed. And what I want to highlight here is just two, and I will put these in the chat box, just two different resources that you can use if you were teaching this skill. And it might be helpful to Google the steps, especially like a skill like brushing the teeth, because it might be helpful to the person to start out with something and then either add on, maybe subtract some steps depending on where the person's at. And also being specific about certain language and terminology you're using, right? So this one, and someone else in the chat box also talked about the 45-degree angle, right? But what does that even mean? What does that look like in the mouth when you're brushing your teeth, right? Also, looking at this is very specific from Verywell Health in terms of brushing behind the upper front teeth, brushing behind the lower front teeth, brushing the top surfaces of the teeth, brush the tongue and insides of the cheeks. And Natasha, that is a really great experience. That's a really great question about asking about their past experience. And that would make a really great open-ended question, right? Hey, Earl, thank you so much for meeting with me today to talk about this skill of brushing your teeth. Can you tell me a little bit about your past experiences with brushing your teeth? Great open-ended question, Natasha. Thank you. There is one more question here, and I did want to ask everybody this, if anybody wants to answer. What did you notice about the process of writing the list? Did you find this process of writing out the steps easy or challenging? I'm curious. Yeah, absolutely, Ricky, right? So really thinking about even storing the product, right? So that might be one of the last steps, putting everything away and finding a safe place and secure place to do so. Okay, so Katie, you found it fairly easy, but Alexander, it was a little bit more challenging since you didn't have a reference for who you were tailing it toward. Right, and I think that's important that you mentioned that, and I appreciate that that was your experience, because that tells me that when you do this in the future and you are developing steps maybe for a skill with somebody, you are going to be very focused on tailoring it toward that person. And yeah, Natasha, there's a lot of steps to brushing your teeth. Some of you had 10, some of you had more. This Colgate has 5, Verywell Health has 9. But it really does depend on the person and what their needs are. And yes, Connie, that's definitely going along with what Natasha said, right? So a lot of the skills we're learning and that we're teaching we don't have to tell ourselves as we're brushing our teeth, okay, I'm going to take my right hand and I'm going to open the drawer, I'm going to grab the toothpaste, and I'm going to take my toothbrush and I'm going to open the cap with my thumb and I'm going to pour 2 pea-sized amounts of toothpaste on the toothbrush. We don't have to do that, right? Because we just brush our teeth. Because this is a skill that has now been overlearned, so we don't have to think about doing the steps. And it's really important to remember that, because there might be things that you aren't thinking of because you're just doing them that might actually be really integral in the person you're working with learning how to achieve this skill and learning how to use this skill. So it's really important, Connie, to be cognizant of that as well. Thank you, Natasha and Connie, for bringing that up. All right, so thank you all so much for your engagement in this activity. I hope that it was something you found helpful. And I just want to go over some things that we already started talking about. So it is hard to break down overlearned skills. So that challenge of figuring out what steps to put down, like Connie said, it's because they're overlearned. Brushing your teeth, washing your hands, cooking something, it's going to feel automatic. And that's where you want the person to eventually get to. Having that continuity and repetition, because that's going to get them to the place where they are also overlearning that skill. How you perform the skill also depends on the context you will use it in. So again, talking about that physical environment of, taking a shower in a hotel versus taking a shower at home. And then the different supplies and where to get those supplies. And thinking about when developing the steps, does the person need to actually start at the grocery store or start someplace where they can acquire resources? Or does it start in their home where they're actually performing the skill? And then just think of how everyone does things differently, right? So again, providing that breakdown of the steps for the client to keep, and then taking that back with you so that the steps are consistent, because people do things differently. And in order for the person to learn and have the most success with learning that skill, that repetition of doing the steps over and over and over again is going to really be key. So I'm going to put the evaluation in the chat box. I don't think that's not going to be the evaluation. Hold on a second. Let me go back to this. That did not do the whole thing. There we go. Okay. That is the evaluation. So it's okay, Connie. I understand what you're saying. So the only thing I can say to that is I don't necessarily think there's a better system. I think it really, for you, is going to be you having a discussion with the person on what's going to be best for the person. And I think the example you're using in terms of washing chicken or turkey is a really good example, because there are going to be people whose parents or grandparents or family members and friends have been washing chicken, and they're not going to care that the recommendation now is not to do that to avoid spreading of bacteria, because that's not how, that's not aligned with their cultural values. It's not aligned with what they were initially taught as a child. So it really depends on the person. And all you can really do is have a conversation with the person about, like, hey, you might want to be very mindful of hygiene and bacteria. And, for something specifically like washing chicken, you might want to add in a step at the end of making sure that the person's cleaning their sink in order to avoid the spread of germs and bacteria. So you can give that information and say, hey, this is what the recommendation is, but they might still want to do it. They might not want to do it. It could go back to like washing rice. I've seen videos online where it's like, you need to wash your rice because there could be bugs in your rice. That might stop somebody from, or that might encourage someone to wash their rice, but it might not encourage someone to wash their rice. So it really kind of depends on the person and what their needs are. And I hope that makes sense. Let me know if I answered the question well enough. So our next session is going to be our final session, and we're going to talk about providing and documenting services. And the only thing I'm going to ask everybody to do, if you can, is for the next and final session, just try using the skills teaching template. And even if you don't actually get to use it with the person, if you all could just review it and, let us know what you think about it. Is it something that you might use in the future? Sorry, I need to pull that link up. Is it something that, might be helpful? You don't think it would necessarily be helpful? Let us know. So that's it. That's all I have. I'm going to stop the recording.